Hello. Yeah. Thanks, Ashish. And thanks, Partha, for this wonderful presentation. As usual, gives a lot of room to think about. I had one set of questions, but I think I'll just make certain, as Ashish said, provocations. More in the line of thinking what you've said through, as well as what Ashish is talking in terms of Calcutta's method in a certain sense. Where do I begin? Now, one of the things is to begin with the Victoria Memorial itself. On the one hand, it can be seen as an edifice of colonial grandeur and its mastery over empire, and the white town stamping its domination over the black town, and so on and so forth, with all of the connotations of race, empire, hierarchies that go into it. On the other hand, it might be quite provocative to think of this space as what certain observers at that point in time, as well as certainly now, is to see it as a dramatic edifice of theatre, of a certain kind of excess and kitsch, which by the time in the 1920s when it comes about, it's really kind of archaic by then, if you're thinking about the Impressionists, and all of that has gone on in France and even in Indian art at that moment. This is indeed an archaic kind of thing. So one of the things is to just think through the timing of this monument when it comes about in India, and what could it have meant in certain sense, even to certain people of that period, which is to then open up the question into two directions. One is about the theatricality of this space, and the other the temporality of what Pathoda said in terms of the big break that happens with colonial Calcutta in the 1940s. One is to go into theatre, and one kind of, in a certain sense, again, this is not to question what has been said, but to open up maybe the issue of colonialism and when and where a colonial city ceases to be colonial, into a much more layered history probably, rather than read it through these landmarks of shift in governance in the 1850s, the rise of nationalism, the relationships between black town and white town becoming more and more rigid, to open that up into a new kind of domains, so as to say. So the theatre, for example, within the kind of the area between the white town and the black town, there is this nebulous area of CR Avenue and Dharamtala onwards, which for a long time was occupied by a huge number of theatrical establishments, most notably the Parsi Theatre, for example, within which we have a Parsi entrepreneur actually running the biggest theatrical concerns in Calcutta, in opposition to the Nationalist Art Theatre in a certain sense. There's a competition between these two institutions. Now, this kind of a presence, which would include a Parsi entrepreneur, Bengali playwrights, an entrepreneur who has all the rights to Bankim Chandra's novels, and straightforward European or Anglo-Indian actresses, kind of muddies the picture of when the city started to become slightly more opened up to newer dimensions of history. Now, these things had been there earlier, but people like Madden, and especially how things turn out to be until the 1920s, that I think is a moment when things become different in Calcutta in terms of a far more interesting mix between East, West, white, black, and all of that, for multiple reasons. One is the coming of this new kind of commercial theatre, which is open to the publics, where both British or Europeans and Indians are going to, like the Royal Opera House opens in Bombay. And the other is also the manner in which Calcutta becomes modern in this part of the city, so the Dharamtala and the Chorang area, where new kinds of jobs open up, more and more Indians enter this space, and there is, in a certain sense, a modernization of Calcutta, which is of a very 20th century kind. It cannot be reeled back into a 19th century history. So, I mean, I would read a certain break in the narrative that you're giving at a certain layer. What you've said is absolutely fine if read through a certain filter. But if we change the filter to 20th century modernization, markets, new forms of professions, the commercial, entertainment world, maybe a certain different kind of picture begins to emerge at this point in time, which I think has a tremendous impact in the manner in which a new kind of modern Bengali society also emerges out of an interaction with a new 20th century literature rather than 19th century Victorian fiction, pulp, cinema, and so on and so forth. And cinema is already here in this part of town from the 1890s. And by the 1920s, one feels even from the archives that all Indian cities, especially Bombay and Calcutta, are going through a new kind of transformation, which is, one could say, outside of the edifices of authority. So to take this edifice of theatricality into Madden and its backdrops, and to pose that there is a certain kind of a dimension of a middle class coming into being from the 1920s, which wouldn't fit into temporally or in terms of its logics into the history of nationalism versus the bourgeois nationalism versus colonial governance and so on and so forth. Something else seems to be happening, which is in a certain sense indigenous, a certain kind of hybrid culture. And one of the things that I find interesting is that the legacy of nationalist forms of historiography, when they come to areas such as theatre, inevitably leave out Madden. Inevitably leave out a certain history of interactions between Europeans and Indians, which might be between the traders, the civilians, Europeans who are coming, and the Indians who are mixing with them, the Anglo-Indians and the Indians mixing. These kind of histories are somewhere elided out of the binaristic divisions that the nationalist versus the colonial, or the white versus the black. And in some senses, therefore, nationalist historiography itself becomes an occlusion of a certain kind. In itself seems to be a racist kind of project, where certain kind of things are left out for the convenience of creating that binary kind of narrative, which makes it all very convenient to then have other forms of hegemonic narratives about both nationalism and colonialism.
Following up Kaushik, and especially in response to what Parthoda said, that this changing sort of a structural change of the city that you pointed out, and beginning from the centrality of Fort William, which still seems to remain, that centrality remaining as the center of the army headquarters of this part of the country. There is a periphery that I was thinking about, that the kind of the lines between even the streets and the roads between this, the White Town and that connected the so-called Black Town. I'm particularly thinking of a place like, let's say, Rafi Ahmed Kidwai Road, beyond which the people from this Govindapur area were rehabilitated, and towards the Maratha ditch and that kind of. So then what you pointed out, that the city has particularly these historic moments, the 1943 famine and the riots in particular, which happened a few kilometers away from here. There are these streets which are like the thoroughfare, which sort of right from the point Calcutta is being mapped. These seem to connect, and there is a traffic of publics who come from various parts, from let's say, also if you were to consider the Shialda station, and from Shialda station people coming and walking and and walking into these spaces to work, and later also there are cinemas that Kaushik was mentioning, there are eateries and so there is a particular way in which I would say people and the public reclaim such colonial structures. And so in that sense, the contemporary structural change that we talk about, that the eastern part is developing or the southern part has extended, and the pin code of Calcutta extends up to north 24 Parganas to south. So Calcutta is no longer what we knew. So really, I would like to I was wondering if since we are having this adda, so whether these sort of connections can be made even for an earlier period, and the kind of, especially the narratives or the films. We were just talking about Jamai Babu before we came here. There are many sort of narratives which tell us that there are these, or when we walked into the Victoria Memorial, there is a crowd who are really not from Calcutta, who inhabit the spaces. So what is this? How does one do the history of a city? Or can we rethink the history of the city through streets and these parallel lines and the connecting lines? And I was also, in fact, thinking of, I was reading up a bit, and a place like Amas Street that you mentioned, it is also considered to be a thoroughfare. So it is in that light. I was wondering if we could take the sort of adda forward. Yeah.
Well, two responses. First, in terms of reclaiming colonial structures and various colonial forms, yes, that's exactly what has happened. I mean, that's what I was suggesting, that just as the European business houses were taken over by Indian business houses, European clubs were taken over by wealthy Indians, and so similarly European areas, places of habitation, offices, buildings and so on have all... Yes, no. See, one of the things that the dividing line of 1947 is obviously a kind of arbitrary line one chooses because, in a sense, the historical events of 1947 are clearly so significant and stand out, right? Now, if you were to trace specific sites and specific institutions, of course, the transitions, you will have a longer period over which these transitions take place. So that itself does not, disturb the overall sort of narrative form of the history. But the more interesting question which Kaushik was asking, which is how do we understand some of these instances of, as it were, mixed or hybrid sorts of histories that clearly one can find instances of this in the 1920s, 30s, and so on. And I think the Madden's theatres are a particularly interesting example. One could find other examples of this in other sorts of areas. Now, my general response would be that these particular instances are not seen, or they don't strike us as having great significance, except perhaps some kind of potential, right? Precisely because, if I may put it bluntly, that in fact there has not emerged a very clear post-colonial bourgeois modernity in Calcutta at all. You see, that has not emerged. If in fact you did have a clear cultural formation emerging in Calcutta after independence, in terms of art, culture, business, perhaps politics, right? Education, all of these things together, as a kind of formation, which is, then perhaps, an enterprise like Madden's might have been far more significant. But compared to many other parts of India, it is certainly true that in fact Calcutta, compared to what it was in the sense of a kind of colonial cosmopolitan culture of the earlier periods, Calcutta has become far more provincial than it ever was. And I think it's in that sense that you begin to see, well, the Maddens, you can look back with the kind of wishful, memory. Oh, it would have been wonderful if this might have been the form that much of Calcutta's theatres might have taken. It didn't. It didn't. In fact, the theatre form that did emerge in the 50s and 60s, they were very popular in north of the city. They were a very distinctly melodramatic form of nationalist theatre.
Okay. No, but one question, Partho, that might then emerge immediately is, if one were to say, for example, that we do not have a modern bourgeoisie, in comparison to the kind of bourgeoisie that may have existed, say, for example, in between the wars, that saw a kind of a flourishing of the arts, then two things. One is that are we not then reprising precisely what the British were saying about India as they were leaving it, that you don't have the capacity to produce this? And is this not then, in a sense, a kind of consequence of what many historians have described as actually the kind of promiscuity of the inability of the imperial apparatus in colonialism to put together a structure that had any kind of long duty consistency? I mean, by which I mean the scandal of empire, as one historian has called it, would precisely be in the extraordinary inconsistency even of imperial structures to maintain any ethical principle. I mean, I was just thinking about, we are going to see on Saturday, when we go to Metia Burj, just before that we're going to see Satranj Ke Khiladi, this film called The Chess Players, and in that you have General Outram basically saying of Wajid Ali Shah that this man is merely a poet and an artist, he knows no governance, and he has therefore no business to rule. That kind of ethical precision, saying that you cannot rule because we know how it's done and you cannot do it, would be actually one of the legacies, if you like, of imperialism, wouldn't it? I mean, in other words, and I'm just saying, just to give an extreme example, and this is something that social sciences in India have been dealing with extensively. The human rights lawyer and activist K. Balgopal, speaking about the elites in what is presently Telangana, which is highly caste segregated, a kind of a structure of feudalism created by the British, was the way in which that those communities could modernize, could actually acquire new property, could move into new kinds of cultural aesthetic modes by retaining certain structures intact. And then he made this famous line, modernity happens but changes nothing. That idea of a certain kind of a change amidst a kind of a lack of change, would that not be one of the consequences of colonialism as we've inherited it?
You see, I would hesitate to generalize in the way that you've done for the whole of India. You see, the point I was making was far more specifically about Calcutta in the period after independence, as compared to other metropolitan cultures in India. Bombay most specifically, but maybe in more recent times, even many of the urban centers in the south. So I think that is where the distinction I was trying to make, that in fact the sense my argument would be that the kind of social forces which are capable of producing this kind of formation, this kind of cultural formation, which is modern, which can borrow if necessary from other places, and yet build something which connects with a vibrant economy, with a much more self-confident, cultural position. That project has failed. I am not suggesting that the project did not exist. One can find this in the history of Bengal at certain points of time. But the project has clearly failed. It doesn't exist now at this moment. And that's what I was trying to, in a sense, explain by looking back at this very peculiar colonial as well as post-colonial history, which is I think, quite different from the way other cities have developed in India.
The things, in response to what you said, I mean, I don't know whether it is the failure, ethical failure of the colonial regime, or it's something else. Number one is that there was this, and again, the 20th century, I think, in Calcutta is the moment where everything unravels in a certain sense, because at that moment, there's a clash between the cultures of the colonizers, who are very old-fashioned Victorian, and an Indian society that is modernizing on its own, which I was trying to point out. And there's a clash because the bureaucrats, obviously, as we know from the work on the art school syllabus and things like that, how retrogressive they were. But I think the most important thing in the manner in which I think British colonialism differs from French or Spanish colonialism, and this is the first part of my thing, is that the British did very categorically leave the word culture out of governmentality beyond a point. Now, that I think is one of the most interesting things that happens, whereas the French and the Spanish went whole hog and imposed the metropolitan culture. The British did not, and they had this very strange kind of schizophrenic relationship with the realm of culture. You legislate education, you only find culture dangerous if it is nationalistic and so on and so forth. But there never was that ethical thing in the beginning, in the British thing, in a certain sense. So I think the cities which have, global cities, colonial cities which have done well in the period following are two. One is centers which have had colonial authority being imposed from the top with a certain kind of belligerence. And the other, like Bombay, which had absolutely no colonial control, which could have independence of a certain kind because it was run by the money of the merchants. Like Bombay is therefore much closer to Singapore or Hong Kong, which is run by mercantile capital. And the colonial control is mainly seeing whether the ships land in time or smuggling and things like that. It's not really a port. So Bombay has a port city kind of history. So I don't know whether the ethical issue is at stake at all in this.
It also reminds me of this extraordinary phrase by Richard Hogarth when he was actually speaking on British cultural policy, saying that Britain had no cultural policy before 1950s or something. So astonishing how completely they eliminated this.
Actually, I was thinking of what you said at the onset, that in the kind of conversations that we are having, then how really to sort of bring back that question, Calcutta as a method. What is it's suggesting in terms of to read other instances? What is specific, if not specific, but what are the categories or elements that can help us, probably the kind of comparisons that Kaushik was also making with Delhi and with Bombay. How does this kind of study of Calcutta allow us to use it as a method, or does it?
Look, Calcutta as method was not my phrase, so I take no responsibility for it.
Continuing on, now that we can open this up, also because we have the summer school participants here, with the permission of everybody else, I'm going to ask the summer school participants first if they have any comments or questions. 1 minute, we'll come to you in a bit. I'd also like to sort of pick on Kaushik's provocation of making a connection with Hong Kong and Singapore. In relation to the kind of city-states that did establish some degree of autonomy within a colonial structure. And maybe invite Chua Benghuat, who's here? Is Benghuat? He's,
Want to get some fresh air.
he's going to get some fresh air. Okay, in his absence, anybody from the summer school to start with? For a question, comment? Yeah? No. Anyone? The first question is always the hardest. Sorry? 1 minute. We'll come to all of you a little bit later. May I suggest Professor Sukhantu Chowdhury, if you'd like to come in with a question or comment?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for this rather embarrassing sort of priority. I did have a comment which I would like to make in response to Bhattacharya. When he said that, the sort of, not total, but very considerable flight of the Bengali youth out of Calcutta in recent times shows that colonial Calcutta no longer holds any attraction for them. Maybe what makes them flee the city is the fact that colonial Calcutta does not exist. They would have preferred a system, an order more in line with that. But in fact, since independence come partition, Kolkata has been taken over completely by a different set of forces. Beginning with the fact that after partition, setting off the biggest mass migration in human history, 8 million people, 6 in one direction and 2 in the other. That meant that in the immediate post-independence scenario, for decades, Kolkata's discourse, unlike that of the other cities in India, was primarily one of deprivation, of anger, and of a sense of disintegration, really. And this meant that, all kinds of reasons, but one being that new capital was not coming in, old capital began to fly out. British capital not being replaced as to the extent it should have been, let alone topped up by Indian capital. The state of jute industry to begin with, as of now, only about 1/3 of the total number of jute mills of 1947 are still in operation. The engineering and foundry industry of Howrah. And that capital was not plowed back into anything new within Kolkata or Bengal. It went out of the state altogether. See? So that sort of economic support that, in a sense, any kind of educational, cultural change needs, that didn't exist. After a great delay, money began to flow in from Delhi. Partly for the development of Kolkata from the 1970s in the form of the Calcutta Metropolitan Development Authority. Partly educational and cultural subsidies and grants, largely rooted to the UGC, the University Grants Commission. But there was no sort of economic support that could uphold a meaningful educational and cultural change to bind the society of Kolkata together in a new way. Okay. I just thought I'd offer that for your comments generally.
Anything?
Thank you.
No, yes, I completely agree with that, what Sukhantu just said. In fact, just to support this argument, that's exactly what I was saying, that for those of the English-speaking classes of the city, the colonial, which is the desirable colonial, exists somewhere else. It's not here. And this being football season, maybe I can give you this analogy. When we grew up in this city, football happened here on these grounds out here. And we grew up on stories of Indian teams beating British military teams. Well, for the young in the city now, football happens in Barcelona and Manchester. So it's a very different, setting.
Tapati, and then we'll have to open it up.
Hi. I wanted to take up something that Kaushik raised, and I wanted to bring the discussion back to this institution of the Victoria Memorial, its architecture, its happening. You talked about the anomaly of this kind of structure being built in the 20s, when there is a new modernist aesthetic in art, literature, film, everything else. See, what's worth reflecting on is that in 21 or 22, when this is coming up, the fact that it is happening in Calcutta, which has ceased to be the imperial capital, it was Curzon's great wish that the memorial must be in Calcutta and not in Delhi. Okay? So this is a big tussle that even though Curzon plans it, that whether the memorial would finally happen in Calcutta or Delhi, because Delhi was the new capital. And as you know, that Emerson thinks of it as his Britain's answer to the Taj Mahal, the Indo-Saracenic. Becomes a very interesting point to think about in the 20s, I think. And the fact that it is anomalous in its grandeur. It is meant to be the grandest of all the Victoria memorials anywhere in the world. But what's also very interesting to think about how effectively, and I'll use the term effectively, the monument has been decolonized. It's an empty mausoleum to the Queen. And for most people, the fact that it is a British imperial monument, I think from the 50s onwards, it was very systematically there was a National Portrait Gallery put in, etc. But the other was this point about the different timelines of when a different Indian modernity may have intervened in these very areas. I think it's worth remembering that, and you're absolutely right, that it is in the 1920s, around the time that the Madans are showing this, that the Government Art College has its first Indian principal, Mukul Rai. The Indian Museum very soon after that, all colonial institution would have its Indian director. So you have Indianized professionals occupying this very center of colonial governance and knowledge systems. And I think that point is worth marking, that which you were saying, that the Indian Society of Oriental Art is coming up here. The Academy of Fine Arts, one of the first national galleries, is set up within the Indian Museum, the Princess, so that in some ways this entire stretch along Chourangi, there is a very distinct way in which a new modern Indian class is coming up. And I just wanted to flag that, to say. And the ultimate irony is, of course, something when you're talking about this kind of memorial and art, was that I always reflect on the fact that the Victoria Memorial today is sitting, has rescued Abanindranath and Gaganendranath's paintings from the trunks in which they were banished for years and years and years. But I sometimes wonder what Abanindranath would have said had he known that this would be the destination of where his art would come.
Okay. Yeah, just there are two questions, but before we come to one, just 1 minute, just one. Oh, well, okay.
At the outset, I'd like to thank Professor Parthu Chatterjee for his erudite lecture on the chronology of events that have shaped present-day Calcutta. So I have two simple questions. Number one, that the importance of the shifting of capital from Calcutta to Delhi. Was it a high watershed in the history of Bengali Bhadralok's political role in India? And was it the beginning of the downhill journey of the Bengali leadership in the corridors of power? And number two, that I have been given the impression that while you touched upon 1943 famine, you laid more emphasis on the administrative needs of the empire rather than the man-made nature of the famine. Which one is correct?
Thank you. There's one more there, and then we'll, yeah, go ahead. There.
Good evening, sir. Ovijit here, student of history. You have raised two interesting topics. One is heritage and the other is cosmopolitan culture. And following your footstep, I would like to know what was about the reconciliation in the field of heritage in between the Victorian legacy and the so-called Babu culture.
Yeah, it's working.
Actually, I'm just confused about calling whether Kolkata is still a colonial city. With respect to whether are we talking about decolonization, still the decolonization which is happening, or is it like erasing the history, of what we had. It's also something similar which the particular central government has been doing about changing the names of the streets of, whether it's Canning Lane or Aurangzeb Road or everything, something like that. So how do we say, are you talking about decolonization of the structures? Because we are here, we are not mentioning about decolonization of the minds, People are still servile in certain sense. So I'm just confused about it.
Anyone else? 1 minute. We'll just see if there's anyone from the Interasia collective that. Yeah.
My question is, sir, towards the end of your lecture, you mentioned that there's this certain class of people who are leaving the city because, and which sort of proves the end of colonial Calcutta. My question is that is the if I may use charm of the city or the want to be in the city reducible to its to the colonial associations that were there?
Okay. Shifting of capital in 1911 was clearly a very important landmark. In fact, the decision was made precisely because of what was seen as the threat of the political challenge likely to be posed by the Hindu Bengali middle class, Bengali Hindu middle class, which was the reason why the shifting of the capital was, in a sense, also the partition of Bengal decision being undone. So since that had to be returned, in a sense, to the unification of the two Bengals, the capital was shifted out. Obviously, the fact that the Calcutta was no longer the capital of British India clearly meant that in terms of what was still seen as the future of the colonial presence in India, Calcutta did not figure that prominently, particularly in administrative circles. The business part remained, however. British business did not move out of Calcutta. It continued to be here. And Delhi never emerged as a business, important for business. It was really seen only as an administrative center. But overall, clearly, it was a very major shift. In terms of the famine now, I mean, there's been so much discussion on the causes of the famine. And what is called man-made, clearly what are seen as the immediate concerns were the artificially created, what was seen to be artificially created shortages, hoarding and so on, profiteering and so on. But the overall reason, the most important reasons compared to prior years, when there was no shortfall in terms of food grain production, and yet there was this shortage. And this, the key policy decision which changed was the decision in 1942-43, that period, to actually reduce imports from outside for the increased army presence. Don't forget, 1942, American troops begin to come in to Calcutta because America joins the war, early 43. And so there is a concern that if shipping lines from Australia and so on were disturbed, then there might be food shortages for the army. And therefore there was the procurement, which was, so there were various companies which were given the task of procuring food grains in order to feed the stocks for the army, as well as for the city of Calcutta, which was seen strategically to be very important. And that was the immediate result, which caused this panic that there will be shortages, and hence people were stocking stockpiles of food grains, leading to profiteering, etc. So now, heritage. I think in terms of heritage, there were, you can see concerns for trying to preserve both of these kinds of memories of colonial Calcutta, both the strictly colonial monuments and buildings, the colonial structures, particularly in this part of the city, as well as the quite decrepit mansions of the old rich, the wealthy Indians who made their money through the colonial connection. They were most of these people in the north with huge mansions were people who were involved in the colonial trades. They were partners, not equal partners, but partners of the British. And that's where they made most of their money. And so there is also a concern to preserve that kind of heritage. Sometimes the initiative is from the families themselves. At other times, the initiative is taken by other people. But there are concerns on both sides, it seems to me. Now, decolonization, whether it is a structural question. In terms of structural, I've given you the picture, which is structurally, yes, it is very largely changed. There is very few colonial structure, whether in terms of the economy or in terms of the administrative structures, whether in terms of the educational institutions. None of those, the purely colonial structures, actually remain anymore. In terms of the mind, the argument that I made was this, that if there still remains a longing for a kind of colonial form of culture, of intellection, this is no longer seen as the place to do it. You have to go some other place in order to do it. And that is what has changed. Earlier, for all of India, not only India, for a large part of this region, Calcutta was the place where people came for a modern education, a particularly Western education. That has changed. That has completely changed. And that is what I was suggesting, that people leave. In terms of, what was that last question? The colonial associations with yes. Now, so is that? So are you asking? Does the colonial constitute? Is the colonial constituted by those associations with the colonial past of the history? You see, since, as I said, that there is very little in the present which you can identify as colonial anymore, right? It is, in fact, the associations with a colonial history which you can define as why is Calcutta different from Gurgaon, right? And the difference is precisely this. Even physically, it looks different. This way, Calcutta and Bombay, probably at least the older parts of Bombay, remain, that kind of colonial city. The interesting question is, you will find structures like this in a city like Singapore. Would you call Singapore a colonial city anymore? I don't think so. I mean, those remain a little part of Singapore which you can, you can go to Raffles Hotel, that's all there is in colonial about Singapore. So I think that is what has changed. So what is colonial still remains monuments like this.
I wanted to give both Kaushik and Madhuja closing comments, if any, and then we'll. Kaushik? Nothing? Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that comes up, obviously, is despite what Professor Chatterjee rightly pointed out as some kind of a one-sided historiography that this city has been subjected to through various recensions of memory and writing down histories. Well, maybe it's time to kind of open up the city to different kinds of time zones and timelines and make it truly post-colonial in the sense that, to write the cosmopolitan histories that remain hidden. I mean, we have no histories of Calcutta cosmopolitanism after the 19th century. I mean, we have nothing for the 1920s, 30s, or even earlier. I think the First World War is a turning point. So I think that is I would end with that, is that now is the time to kind of open it up to other histories that were hidden by the logic of the colonial, which would include the nationalist as well in a certain sense, to completely reinvent a new look at the city. And maybe that will...
In fact, on similar lines, that what I suggested in the beginning, that there were already, even in the pre-independence times, spaces which were outside this sort of colonial, outside the shadow of the colonial structure. So it's quite interesting for me, and from what emerges from the discussion and the questions from the floor, is this, the remapping, literally, and the centrality of these colonial structures are shifting, and what Parthoda was saying, that do you, just because these structures still exist as some kind of a tourist spot, do you still consider, let's say, Singapore as a colonial city? So that I think is, I thought was a very interesting way to sum up the discussion. That it has sort of considerably restructured. The map of the city has been restructured, and locations that were understood as swampland or jungle or whatever has sort of shifted the center, as it were. That's what I would like to sort of think in terms of the discussions that are going on.
Yeah. There is a lot to say. This is certainly not, as no Adda ever is, the last word on any topic. But I suppose it's time. It is time to call it a day and to think once again of all of us being in this particular space. Sorry, we're winding up now. And so, thank you very much, Partho. And thanks very much to Madhuja for having made this happen. Thanks to Jayantada. Oh, sorry, there's a final question there. Shall we just take that? Okay, let's go. Right, go ahead.
This is a very beautiful evening. I thank the organizers, and at the same time, I am raising a question about the comparison between India, Calcutta in particular, and Singapore. Singapore is a colonial piece of land spanning over 600 kilometers. And its population is about simply 7 million around. So, it may be a very picturesque situation in terms of commercial improvement and other things. But how can a comparison be made between an area like India, which is spanning 32,88,000 square kilometers? The comparison is...
it does not work.
Like David and Goliath.
Right.
It cannot be.
It cannot.
And again, one more question. With more money, I salute the erudition of Sri Chatterjee. The sculptures, the statues in Calcutta and elsewhere were replaced by nationalists. Yes, of course, it was replaced. But I am in favor of retention of this in a cluster of area. And these these statues of governor generals and British administrators were replaced by, Sri Chatterjee told, by nationalist leaders, etc., and freedom fighters. But no, there were some statues which had their cosmopolitan or international concept, like in place of Lord Curzon, Karl Marx and Hegel and Lenin statues, who believed in internationalism.
Thank you.
I thought that Mr. Chatterjee simply forget it to mention.
Okay.
This much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. No, I think we'll have to wind up now. Jadavpur? Okay, well then, absolutely last. Good. Very brief. Very, very brief.
Yeah, so to drag this long, yeah. So, taking a cue from the colonial economy and politics which you mentioned, sir, the Calcutta Maidan which you mentioned in your speech transformed into the graveyard for young student revolutionaries who rebelled against the decaying bourgeois political system into the 60s and 70s. And also there was this agrarian crisis, food crisis and mass unemployment which saw the making of iconic Calcutta trilogy by Shotoitra and Mrinal Sen. So if you could please shed some light into the decades of 60s and 70s of Calcutta. Thank you.
Oh God, that's a big question. Maybe it's too big to answer at this particular point, so we will leave it. I mean, it's clearly an incredibly important period and certainly one where many questions were asked and further discussions would actually take us precisely to that time. Thank you very much. Thank you all and good night.